If, like me, you don't have a computer science degree, or maybe you have no previous work experience, but you want to become a junior developer, building a portfolio is probably the best chance you have of standing out. It's kind of crazy because just 2 or 3 well-placed, nicely packaged and described projects on your portfolio can send such a strong signal to an employer about your ability to do the job, your enthusiasm, and I think it also shows employers that as someone without formal education, this isn't just a hobby for you. That being said, there are some alarmingly common mistakes that new developers make on their portfolios, like using skill charts, showing too much bravado when really you should be expressing your humility and teachability, and one more thing I'll mention is sort of listing tutorial projects almost like they're your own. Don't do that. In this video, I'm going to show you what employers are looking for in a junior front-end web developer's portfolio based on things I've learned hosting the Scrimba podcast, speaking with experts on Twitter, and crucially, I will be showing you not 1, not 2, but 3 example portfolios from junior developers who were recently hired in the last 12 months. We'll be using those as concrete examples and teaching opportunities. This way you know what I'm talking about actually works because these developers have actually gone on to find work. Along the way, we're also going to explore whether you need to build and design your portfolio from scratch or if it's okay to use a template. My name's Alex, let's get into it. Before we jump in and go too far, I want to implore you to think about the objective of your portfolio. Probably it's so that you can stand out in front of an employer and get your first junior developer job. Maybe it's to find freelance clients, but the important thing is that you nail your objective because that is going to inform every decision we make next. If your objective is indeed to become a junior web developer, then to satisfy that objective, you need to demonstrate some competence, enthusiasm, commitment, and humility. In other words, you want to demonstrate your potential. This is something I want you to keep in mind as you decide what projects to build and how to describe and position yourself on your portfolio. I would also encourage you to think about how to stand out and be a bit more memorable by trickling some personality and character into the text on your website, the copy, as well as your design. But Alex, I'm not good at design. Me neither. I mean, I'm a self-taught developer, not a designer. I think it's important to acknowledge and respect that those are 2 discrete skills. Yes, it is true that the best looking portfolios have a nice design. And yes, it's also true that even if your focus is code, the best front-end developers also appreciate and understand and have some acumen for design and user experience. But let me remind you, humbly, you are not the best developer today. You are an aspiring junior and the rest will come. A big part of many junior web developer roles is taking designs and converting them into responsive websites. Why then would the employer care if you're good at design? Your job isn't to design the website, it's to convert the copy. And I think if you want to be good at design, most employers will recognize that you are going to sort of absorb that knowledge as you work on more projects with experienced designers. But it could also be that you don't even want to be good at design. Maybe your passion is more on the behavior or interactivity side, the JavaScript side of web development. And in that case, it's not even reasonable to expect that you be good at design. This is where the template argument comes in, because if you don't have design skills, it's possible you're going to inadvertently hurt your opportunity if you don't lay out your information clearly. The most important thing, and I want to stress that to you now, is the content of your website, which is made up primarily of your projects, but also the text and copy on your website, such as your description. These are great places to let the employer know where you're coming from, where you want to go, and sprinkle in your personality. But ultimately, if you don't have a couple of good projects, there really isn't much point in having a portfolio because you could be served by other platforms like LinkedIn and so forth. So what makes a good project for a portfolio? It's a very legit question. Here's what I've observed speaking with senior developers, hiring managers, and newly hired developers on the podcast and spaces and things like that. I think on one end, on the more basic end, you could build something like a advanced calculator. I'm thinking of like a salary calculator that deducts tax contributions or something. You could also build like a coffee to water ratio calculator for coffee enthusiasts. That's a perfectly good type of project for your portfolio. And maybe you agree it's relatively basic compared to some more production level apps. On that end of the spectrum, one student at Scrimba built a homeschooling app because they were homeschooling their son while learning to code. Now, this to me feels like a great project because it solves a specific problem. That person can tell a story around the problem. It also feels more like a real, not real app, but it feels more like a project or a product versus a utility. And that's what makes it like a really great project. But the truth is, everybody's at a different place. Not all junior developer jobs are made equal. If your project falls on either end or in between that spectrum, I think it's a good project for your portfolio. The most important thing, honestly, is that you apply some degree of polish. Like, ideally, it's going to be responsive. Maybe you'll deploy it. No matter what, I feel like it should look relatively polished. Another question you could ask yourself is, where did you get stuck and how did you overcome that? If you got stuck, that means you are pushing your skill level. And that's drive. That's something you can write about in your project description on your website, and it's also a story you can tell during your interview. Both of these will make you more memorable, and I also feel like, again, if you were struggling, that means you're pushing the upper limits of your ability. In the introduction, I kind of mentioned, don't kind of claim tutorial projects as your own. You wouldn't pass that litmus test about did you get stuck and how did you overcome it because you had a tutorial, you had a guide, you had the key. You wouldn't really pass that question. And so it might not make a good project for your portfolio. With that in mind, let's look at some junior developer portfolios that actually enabled these students to get jobs. And I'm going to be very honest. These portfolios are good. They're really good. But they're not perfect because they are juniors, right? And that's okay. I think so often we set such high standards for our portfolios, thinking they have to be the absolute best reflection of our work. And that causes like analysis paralysis, where we don't actually make progress towards our goal. And that's a big shame, in my opinion. I'm going to show you a variety of different portfolios from junior developers with different skill levels and slightly different interests and objectives. I'm not here to review them as such, but I would like to highlight some of the things they did well, things you can consider, and here and there I'll sort of suggest things we could learn with the benefits of hindsight. Each of these 3 students who created these projects have actually featured on my podcast, the Scrimba podcast, where we talk a little bit about their approach to their portfolio and what the employers actually ended up thinking about the portfolios and work once they got their foot in the door and got the job. We're going to start with Alejandro from Canada, who, by the way, featured in a mock React.js job interview with myself and a Scrimba teacher named Cassidy Williams. You can find a link to that in the top. Let's have a look. So right away, we have a very clear description about Alejandro that shows enthusiasm because they love it, commitment because they're a lifelong learner, and also a little bit of personality as they express their love for tradition Neapolitan pizza. When you apply for a junior developer job or put your portfolio in front of an employer, it's either going to be someone from the HR side or it's going to be another developer. HR people in particular, I think, are going to want to see a list of your skills, which is why I think it's really smart that Alejandro has featured them high and proud in their portfolio. This way, the hiring manager can sort of connect the job description to your portfolio. I like how Alejandro further describes themselves here and offers a link to continue reading for anybody that might be interested. So far, this structure is really, really good. Now, if you've ever thought about whether you should write in the first person or the third person, which can sometimes sound really pro, I would say always write in the first person unless you're a conference speaker. And even then, one nice little pattern I see some speakers do is offer a tab for different versions of their bio. By chance, Cassidy Williams, who did the interview with Alejandro and I, this is how she presents her description on her portfolio. Okay, so here's the really important part, the projects of the project portfolio. The first thing I like is how Alejandro has featured a fairly compelling and clear screenshot, along with a list of the technologies used. This kind of reinforces the skills we saw at the top, which I think makes them more credible and further expands on what Alejandro can do for the employer. There's also a short description of the project, which I think is non-negotiable. Ideally, the person looking at your portfolio can understand everything at a glance. They shouldn't really need to go and click the project, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But first, I want to highlight how there is a View Project button that takes you to a dedicated page for each project. Most people don't do this, but I highly recommend it because, like Alejandro does here, you can expand a lot on the sorts of purpose of the project, a little bit about the technology stack and things like that. Moving on, I think you should aim to deploy your projects and offer a link to that project. But as I sort of alluded to, ideally the reviewer or employer, I should say, has seen enough screenshots and read enough about the project that they don't really care about clicking the link beyond just verifying this is a real thing and it exists. The reason I say this is because you can't exactly predict how the reviewer is going to experience your websites. For example, they could be using a weird browser, or maybe they're a bit unorthodox and run into an edge case bug within a few seconds. Even if it wasn't totally fair, it's not going to leave a good impression, and there's no need for it since it's your website and you can control the narrative. I'll also add that you want to make things as easy as possible for the person looking at your websites. Learning how to use your app, or assuming it's a bit more ambitious if there's a login or register form or something, it's just too much work for an employer who's going through a few different candidates. And so this is where the screenshots and maybe even better yet, a video can come in. That's a really good idea, by the way. If you can record a 2-minute presentation about your project, show your personality a little bit and how well you can present, or at least practice, that's unique. Not many. In fact, I've never seen that on a junior developer's portfolio. Going back to the main page here, Alejandro includes their email and a get in touch button, which takes the user to Calendly. As a junior actively looking for a job, I probably wouldn't use Calendly because really the recruiter or the hiring manager will want to be in control of the workflow and the calendar tool and the calendar invitation and that kind of thing. This is because they're going to be fitting you in among other candidates. A lot of the onus on scheduling is on them. Still, it's a smooth experience and a cool tool to consider. I might replace the Calendly link with a contact form. As I'm starting to learn, it's a good idea to have both a contact form and an email address. Here's a few more things Alejandro did very well that we can all learn from. It sounds obvious in hindsight, but Alejandro is using a custom domain, which is something a lot of people overlook. They'll use like a Netlify or a GitHub Pages or a Versal sort of subdomain. Likewise, there's no certificate errors or anything like that. This might sound a bit obvious again, but in reviewing portfolios, I will often see inconsistencies in the design. And in Alejandro's case, all the images are nicely sized, they're not stretched or awkwardly cut. The design is breathable, the font and the colors and the presentation are consistent throughout. You don't have to include a photo in your portfolio, absolutely not. But if you do, you want to look approachable and friendly like Alejandro. After all, you want someone to approach you for the job, right? The only other little criticism I would add is that if Alejandro was actively looking for a job, they have a job now, so it's not as important. I would recommend they make it easier to find their resume. But I like this idea to mention the resume on the About page because someone might dart there to learn about Alejandro before realizing what they really wanted is the resume. Elly from Australia recently got their first developer job. They even dropped out of college to learn web development with Scrimba and then build his portfolio as a way to stand out. So it's very cool to see. As you might kind of get the impression, Elly is a bit more design orientated, and that's reflected in her portfolio. You can see that Elly has opted not to include a photo like Alejandro, but an illustration instead. That's something you could consider doing too. In general, I like the idea of having a call to action above the fold. Maybe Elly could have used a more descriptive label, like see my work, but that's a bit of a nitpick. I'm not really in a position to comment about someone else's developer skills, I don't feel like. But what I would say is that the projects do look a little bit more basic than Alejandro's, which is absolutely fine because not all junior developers are in the same place. And Elly found success. They found a job. They get to continue to grow and build more exciting projects while getting paid. So I think we owe Elly some appreciation for that because they've done a fantastic job sort of taking all their efforts and highlighting it without overthinking it and sort of, filtering it too much. The first thing Elly's done is include her portfolio project, which is not contentious, but there are two schools of thought. Josh in his book, for example, says you shouldn't do this. In my opinion, if it's one of your more significant projects, as it appears to be for Elly, you may as well include it. And I think in Elly's case in particular, her website, if you scroll to the top, also has a digital garden and now page, which I think could honestly be their own projects. And so it makes total sense in this case. And while Elly hasn't got a dedicated page for each project, she did write a short description, which is always appreciated. And I like that they've put an emphasis on the technologies because it shows like an enthusiasm for these newer technologies like MDX and an appreciation for concepts like dynamic images. These are actually not, obvious, I would say, like they stand out a little bit. I do think it would be better if there was a dedicated page, but again, this is good and it doesn't matter what advice people offer, right? Because a lot of people have opinions about what makes a good portfolio, but Elly got a job with this portfolio, so we know it has to be, pretty good. Something else Elly has done, which I think is really interesting to highlight, is they have included a to-do app and a movie search app, which they credit in part to the front-end developer career path here at Scrimba, which if you don't know, our main thing at Scrimba is that we have a career path aimed to take you from not knowing any code to being at a hireable level for a front-end web developer. You go through HTML, CSS, JavaScript, React, and there's even some modules about interviewing and things like that. It's all very interactive, project-driven, so you remember what you learn. And obviously we have like this YouTube channel, our podcast, and a bolstering community around the whole thing. Anyway, we don't really suggest that you include projects from the career path in your portfolio unless you give credit, not because we need the credit, but because it just reflects better on you that you share credit. And likewise, if you expand upon it. And I really like that in this case, Elly has sort of expanded on it and talked about how they've refactored the code base and optionally perhaps, added a new feature or presentation to it. I also really like this idea of having something that's coming soon because it kind of gives you a bit more meat in your portfolio and it conveys that you always have a project on the go, which I think is a positive signal. I just want to point out right off the bat that Karan is using a Vercel subdomain, so clearly my advice isn't that good. The point being ultimately that there is no golden rules and these are all just ideas. At the end of the day, your portfolio will play a part in your broader job hunting strategy. And Karan found a huge success actually because they encountered a job description asking for 2 years of experience. Karan had less than 2, maybe one and a bit, and applied anyway. After interviewing, they literally hired him on the spot, sort of proving these requirements don't mean anything to the individual. And honestly, maybe this portfolio, as part of his wider strategy, was a help. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but just want to point out that this says Namaste, which is nice because Karan is from Pune. Again, Karan hasn't included a photo, which is totally fine. Scrolling down a bit, we see quite early on that Karan has a degree. I really think that if you've graduated, and that is no small feat, and you've paid for the privilege, you might as well milk it for what it's worth and talk quite prominently about your degree, as that could just be a green light for some employers. Even though that sounds unfair for self-taught people, I don't think it hurts you if you don't have a degree. I'm just saying if you have it, you might as well take advantage of it. Again, Karan includes a skill list, which I totally support. The only one small bit of feedback I would offer, despite this beautiful presentation, is to add the technology names beneath the logos, because a non-technical person is going to look at this and think it's a leaf and think, what is that? Not knowing it's probably for MongoDB. It just so happens that a friend of ours at Scrimba, Annie the Bomb, who's been on a live stream with Leanne and joined us for Twitter Spaces and things, they're a bit more of an experienced designer. They had a similar idea, and this is I'll overlay it. This is how they sort of executed on the idea. So you can check out her portfolio for a bit more inspiration, even though they've been at this for a little bit longer and more design orientated. Looking at the projects, Karan has a few projects and again highlights the tech, which is good for all the same reasons it was good for Elly. In this case, you'll only see links to GitHub, which I honestly think is acceptable. Again, it would just be better if there was a screenshot and a longer description and a live link and things like that, because a non-technical person, if they click through to GitHub in this case, they aren't going to have a clue how to run this. And if you are talking about a technical person, a technical recruiter or a developer on the team, they're not going to want to run it because they're in a hurry and have other candidates and things like that. Still, a portfolio is just a tool in your wider job hunting strategy. And Karan's is beautiful. It's very clean and nice, which is a perk, and it's easy to understand. I'll also kind of add that just by virtue of having a portfolio, you are at least unique and you will probably stand out because the majority of new candidates don't have portfolios. So I'm really emphasizing that you don't need to be dogmatic about these things, and you can also iterate. A website isn't like a book, right? When you publish a book, I kind of envy authors because they shut the page and it's done. But code-basis projects, they're always evolving, and as a result, you can iterate on your portfolio as you continue to improve. You just don't want to be in a situation where an opportunity crosses your path, but you don't have a portfolio because you were overthinking it. And so what if you started with links to GitHub, but then refactored and rebuilt the section at a later date? Maybe that was Karan's intention before they ended up finding success unexpectedly. The best part about this is how Karan is not linking to like every project. They've narrowed it down to 5 and then added a button which says check my other projects on GitHub. In general, I would say 2 or 3 projects is the minimum on a portfolio. And again, you might be able to pad it out a little bit like Elly did with the coming soon, which has its own perks. But probably 5 is the maximum, because beyond that, it's just a bit hard for the person viewing your portfolio to know where to focus. And so if you have 5 or more, you might need to kill your darlings and pick the projects that you think will best represent your work and increase your chance of reaching the objective we set out at the very beginning. Well, there you have it. Those are the 3 portfolios I intended to show you. I hope you've learned a lot by sort of running through them. I've tried to highlight, I think, some of the most important things as well as some areas to improve. I think it is better to give you some real examples than just sort of run through a checklist. Now, if you do want a template, there is no shame in it. As I said, if you're not design orientated, that shouldn't hurt you. And also you want to be ready for an opportunity should it present itself. The content, I said, is also the most important thing. And so you could start with a template to nail the content. And again, 4th point, reiterating, you can iterate on the portfolio, right? And so, yes, you can check out Theme Forest for portfolios. There's also a few Bootstrap ones. I'm going to link some resources in the description. Another really good resource I can recommend to you is this Twitter thread called Portfolio Review Friday. It's actually a hashtag. It happens every Friday. It's run by someone named Shashi. And I don't know if it will still be running when you watch this video, but what I do know is that those tweets aren't going anywhere, and they are a treasure trove of advice, knowledge, and inspiration, because you can flick through the submissions of other people's portfolios, have a nosy, see what you like and what you don't like, and then you literally get to read feedback from senior engineers who are involved in the hiring process. I think that's super important. I also finally want to give a huge shout out to Josh Cormow's book, because I've read it and, it's longer. It'll take longer to consume than this video, but it is probably the best resource on the web for anybody who's looking to break into tech and build a junior developer portfolio. It's very generously free as well. And, Josh is a really cool guy. He's been on the Scrimba YouTube channel with Leanne in the past as well. So very happy to recommend that resource. And of course, if you want to polish your front-end skills to build even better projects, you can check out Scrimba and the front-end career path. My name is Alex. Thank you so much for watching. If you've made it this far, please do remember to like the video as well as subscribe to the Scrimba YouTube channel, because we as a team, we upload and stream weekly about learning to code and breaking into tech. Hopefully I'll see you soon.